Thank you. Thank you for having me. I will have to start with a standard disclaimer that any views or opinions that are represented in this talk are personal and belong solely to me, the presenter and author, and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that I, the author, may or may not be associated with in my professional or personal capacity. Having said that, we can go to the meat. So many times during this presentation, I will use the word we, and by this I usually refer to the defense community or my perception of it. The word war summons very different feelings across people, and it's tied to very different imagery. The imagined war when I was a kid was this: and nations, people, and armed forces prepared for this nightmare event. We had plans, contingencies, even doctrines around nuclear war and nuclear operations. But luckily enough, we came to a point where we used our nuclear weapons every day by not using them. And then it came the time of electronics and robots, and the idea of these robot overlords crushing our society and freedom populated the imagination of many when thinking about future war. And then it came the time of cyberspace, a space where physical distance has little meaning and in which we're all immersed, adding a dimension to our lives where the senses with which we're born come short, and we need to evolve new ways of understanding our presence in there. Cyberspace has huge strategic implications. The principle being that it is a ubiquitous and pervasive force multiplier that is able to combine, support, and enhance effects delivered by classical operations. So with little understanding of this new space that we ourselves artificially created, came a plethora of new fears and nightmares. And so cyber attacks started to gain their way into mainstream sci-fi and common images of the futures, but actually with some representations that were rather picturesque, let's say, like the one on the left. Cyber attacks are much more about the picture on the right. The interesting take here is that we are actually living in an era of cyber attacks, but their impact is much subtler than we expected. These are not attacks to our physical space or physical reality, but rather to our cognitive space and the way we perceive and decide what is right and wrong, what is true or false. But still, luckily, no widespread apocalypse as pictured in our bleakest dystopian visions. Turns out the actual future war we're fighting has this face, and it's changing the face of the world we're living in. And I would say in some cases that these changes are deep and long-lasting, were not permanent. Think of AI-assisted drug trials, or brute force approaches to cracking pharmaceutical compounds that are able to inhibit the virus, but also the whole teleworking spike and the consciousness that digital transformation has been just a buzzword till now, even for the most tech-savvy industries. And many more of these changes are incoming right now for future forces. Because this pandemic is a war. And at least for the defense community, this is very empowering, because armed forces plan, exercise, learn, and improve exactly in view of these events. So calling upon the metaphor of war, while disconcerting or uncomfortable for the non-military part of the society, is exactly the communication strategy the defense needs to be engaged to its fullest. Now, the wartime imagery is compelling. Of course, it identifies an enemy, that's the virus, a strategy that we have to flatten the curve, the warriors, that's the healthcare personnel, the home front, that are people isolating at home, and the traitors or deserters that are people that are breaking the social distancing rules. And it supports the urgency that underpins drastic policy decisions like the closing of schools, the imposition of travel bans, the halt of economies around the world. And it appeals to the citizens' sense of duty and obligations to serve in their country's hour of need. But of course, this is not the first time leaders and policymakers have used the war metaphor to describe a threat that is not strictly qualified as military. We have the war on poverty, the war on cancer, the war on drugs, the war on crime. So as a civilian, myself, deeply connected with the military world, I completely understand why this metaphor is disorienting for civilians. The two questions I always get here are, well, does this word metaphor mean that we are all soldiers now? My view is, yes, we are. We are all together in this, and every one of us is called to do his part. But of course, we need to find out our internal resources, our inner resources, to make the best out of this period and to look over the horizon and exploit it as a chance of growth. And the other question I always get is it opening the door to new inward-looking nationalisms? I can see the risk. And that is why more than ever, we need an enlightened leadership able to look over the horizon and passing through this curtain of fear and problems. Now, point is that you do not win a war without a plan, with programs and understanding of the environment. In a war, you need armed forces that are able to deter, engage, compete, and win against your adversaries. How do we usually do this? Well, there are three ingredients in a successful campaign: the right strategy, executed in a timely manner with adequate forces. So first, strategy. Strategy in the defense world is what solves the VUCA of the environment. So VUCA is this acronym that means the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity of the environment. Now, VUCA is a way to describe the fact that we have an incomplete vision over the changes from and on the environment. We have an incomplete understanding of the environment itself, something that we sometimes refer to as we have an incomplete situational awareness. We have incomplete clarity of the causation mechanisms of the environment. And we have incomplete actionability of the information we have to deliver the desired effects. So having fixed what a strategy is and what a strategy represents, then you have to execute a strategy. Now, the military are part of that class of organizations that are called high assurance organizations, together with like emergency responders, like firefighters and teams in emergency medicine. And in these organizations where if there's a hiccup in the execution, usually there are people dying around. So there's an extensive attention to planning, to take all the contingencies that are necessary for the execution to be flawless. So when I was watching the Expanse and Amazon Prime video, I came across this sequence where the UN Secretary General, Christian Navasarala, has this conversation. And I have to say that is very fitting and representative of what the planning for the military part is. Problem is that when cold planning, when you do cold planning, you cannot simply plan for any event. So what happens when you try and apply this thinking to the unexpected? We get plans that are unable to support the timely execution of the right strategy. This is why plans are always taken with mixed feelings by grant strategists. Planning is an acquired taste and has to be integrated in the bigger picture. And this brings to our last point on forces. In all sci-fi I can think of, there's always a frantic search for a very specific knick-knack that magically gets all the good guys an advantage, and then they all live happily ever after. Spoiler alert, this is not quite happens in real life. Forces have to be designed, developed, integrated, secured, and fielded. And it's not just a bunch of toys or hardware or future tech. It needs to be fit in the overall structure of the organization and have the organization rearranged to have it fit in it. It's like a symbiotic process. So the new thing changes how the organization behaves, and the organization changes the way that new thing does things. So the set of all the aspects this new things has to interact with, and that has to be taken into account when we want to understand, plan, and integrate it in the structure that we sometimes call it the military instrument of power, is captured in this ugly acronym that is .mlpfi, and it's called a capability. This acronym stands for doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, facilities, and interoperability. So in this 7-letter acronym, there's only one letter that is about toys, that is the M. So whenever we had hardware, it's just one part of the overall capability spectrum that we need to integrate so that we are sure that everything fits in its place. I got a question. The question is, what about allies for this war? Is the entire world the same army? That's a very good question, and it fits perfectly into the concept of capability spectrum. So we are, as a matter of fact, well, most of the world is, as a matter of fact, a single army with respect to this war, and you see that from all the announcements that are made with regards to collaboration, that every research group has to collaborate with the other one without waiting for peer review of results to be published in international journals. In this war is especially relevant the interoperability. So it's very important that every research group is able to communicate in the right way with the other research group so that they can move along together without thinking that one is measuring things in the international system of measure and the other one is measuring length in feet, for example. Capabilities are arranged in capability packages. A capability package defines what is the required capability and compares what's in it against what we don't yet have it, and provides the initial information on the projects that are necessary to achieve the capability, including costs. Now, the problem is that due to the extreme peculiarities of military systems, the development cycle from conception to I'm pressing the red button on the field takes 20 years. This means that whatever the system, it will be fielded in a world that is radically different than the one it was thought into, the one that we're being conceived in. So how can we make up for it? Well, we have to understand that we are designing things for the future, and we have to scope the future so that we are giving our men and women something that is relevant for their role 20 years from now. And we have to understand then the shaping forces that are affecting the production and employment of military power. And there are three main forces that are complexity, convergence, and exponentiality. And then we have to use foresight to scope the bigger picture, to help the military think the unthinkable, to broaden the aperture of planning while maintaining its rigor and precision. So before diving into this section, I have two questions here. The first one is, if we are at war, who are we fighting against? Is the virus fighting us back? Well, viruses has a way to fight back, that is by mutating. So the virus, for their very mechanism of replication, are very prone to have a lot of different variants. So this is a way for the virus to fight back. It's the only way it has to fight back. And I also have another one. Do you think that COVID-19 pandemic will also have positive outcomes in a manner of decreased armed conflicts around the globe, as we see also in the field environment, where it decreases in pollution? I think that this question will get an answer at the very end of the talk. So let's dive into the forces that we had to scope. The first one is complexity. So complexity manifests in the overload of information, interconnections, relations, and implications, and in our hopelessness in solving this puzzle one piece at a time. What you're looking at is the infamous spaghetti slide in Afghanistan, describing the counterinsurgency dynamics in Afghanistan. And the sentence there is the dry comment of General Stanley McChrystal at that time. And this is because these growing number of stakeholders that are combining with the interconnection, with the change and the confluence of technological and socio-technological trends, represents a paradigm shift from a complicated to a complex environment. The main difference is that whereas in a complicated environment, the analysis of interactions among many actors can still deliver reasonable conclusions able to support decision-making, in a complex environment, there are simply too many interactions to be understood in their entirety. We cannot break the problem into smaller parts. Complexity reflects the impossibility of capturing the entirety of interaction and their inextricable nature. So this means that we need new ways of framing the problem. The second force that we look as shaping the future environment for the military force production effect is the convergence. And the convergence is the confluence of future trends and themes. The convergence represents the increasingly intertwined nature of technological progress. Interactions and intersections multiply the effects and bring an explosion of technological innovation. Example, we have progress in software that enables developments in chemistry, and these in turn allow for improvements in biology. So there's a cascade effect across fields. The convergence is chiefly driven by the rate of technological advancement that affects almost every theme from political, human, and socioeconomic to environmental. The interconnectedness will open up the potential for more interaction between trends, and it will result in a boost in technological innovation. The increased rate of advancement in single technologies will lead to new technologies and novel usages that will have disruptive effects. The other very interesting point here is that the exponential growth of technology brings an exponential compression of time, because time has exponentially more value than before as a resource to achieve the desired end state. That is why I'm saying that we are in the so-called second half of the chessboard, remembering the metaphor by Kurzweil of the invention of the game of chess. I have many questions here. So I will go to the end of the section, and then I'll get a shot at the answers, at the questions. I want to go through the last one, talking about exponentiality, the last of the three forces shaping the future environment. Exponentiality is an effect and a cause for the convergence and complexity to happen and thrive. Exponentiality is the characteristic of many trends that are mainly underpinned by technology. So while the best example of this one is the evolution of computing power, that is Moore's law, there is not just Moore's law. It is not a monopoly there. Also, connectivity in terms of bandwidth grows exponentially, and volume of data grows exponentially. And moreover, not all trends are just exponential. Whenever two exponential trends are merging under the force of convergence, depending on some fundamentality characteristics, they produce over-exponential effects. There are very few examples of these uber trends, but they nevertheless exist, and they will likely see significant and unexpected growth in the next 10 years. So the first example that I will not go into, details of this one, is from Alexander Kott at US Army Research Laboratory, and that is weapons capability. Weapons capability, when computed in some kind of figure that is called the figure of regularity, grows as a quadratic exponential. So e to something squared. The second example that I wish to go a little bit into detail of is quantum computing power, that is apparently evolving as a double exponential, e to something. So double exponential is very fast. Just to give you an idea of how fast it is, imagine that in the several thousand years, we increased our computational capacity of 60 orders of magnitude. Now, the computational power, so 60. The computational power of a quantum computer is measured with something called the dimension of its Hilbert space. Going double exponential in this means that we will cover in the next 50 years 300 billion orders of magnitude. So we had 60 orders of magnitude over 1,000 years. We will have 300 billion in 50. In this sense, it's likely, it's reasonable to say that the technological evolution that is incoming in this century will be unrivaled in the history of a human species. So with these forces in action, it's very, very easy to remain locked in one's own worries or have a tunnel vision. And that is risky, because extrapolating for past trends is useful, but is limiting in a complex world of accelerating technological change. And so what we need is a structured way to integrate foresight into defense thinking. So before going into how defense went through this process, I will take some questions here. So I have the COVID is open, the discussion of biowarfare and the impact of human-made pathogens in the long war. So there's a study that was published in Cell, I think, that gives reasonable indications that SARS-CoV-2 is a zoonotic virus, meaning that there's no human messing with it. But of course, I agree that this has brought to in the scene again the point of biowarfare and how easy it is to deliver and gain effects at the global level with a very low level of effort, potentially. Are you concerned about some governments taking advantage of the fear caused by infodemic to abuse power and for this to cause civil unrest? Well, that was one of my points at the very beginning. So that this is one of the risks having these new inward-looking nationalisms. So more than ever, we need, as a foresight community, we need to be present at the tables. We need to be relevant in the products that we deliver at decision makers level. And this is a point that I will also make further on in the talk. What are the major differences in the practice of foresight at defense versus everywhere else? Well, I was one at a conference in Prague, and one of the attendees told me that the way he perceived it is that if you're not good at doing foresight in defense, you don't really need to be good at doing foresight in anywhere else. Because if you fail at foresight in defense, well, then you will probably not be needed in 20 years' time. So, but jokes apart, the peculiarities of foresight in defense are the environment and the unique challenges that you have to face, the sheer number of different angles that you have to tackle all together, and plus the very long time horizon. With defense, and I will go through this in a moment, with defense, you are able to look at 20 years, 30 years, 40 years out. And that is the time horizon, because as I shown before, when you take 20 years to deploy a new capability, it doesn't make much sense actually to think about 10 years time, because you won't have the time to think about new capability and have it deliver in the field. So I would say yes, the multifaceted environment and the very long time horizon, and of course the everything that is related to defense. So this whole idea of confidentiality and all the rest. So how are we integrating foresight into defense thinking? So here's what NATO does with its Futures Work series. So this is the strategic foresight analysis. The NATO Futures Works revolves around four main documents that are the strategic foresight analysis, that is how we look at 20 years time. The latest edition what was published was about 2035. We are currently working at 2040. So we have the description of the future trends and themes. So understanding what signals, trends, and themes are present in the environment, organizing them, and drawing conclusions about what could be a plausible picture of the images of the futures in 20 years time. And then the framework for future alliance operations, that is the military so what of the strategic foresight analysis. This is a very important document in NATO Futures work because it is the confluence of the two parts, the two inspirations of the NATO strategic commands, that is the part that looks at the transformation of the military instrument of power and the part that look at the employment of the military instrument of power. So, and in this document, they both converge and find their own closure. The Framework for Future Alliance Operations, or FFAO, look at what will forces need to be and to do to stay relevant in 20 years' time. And what forces need to be are called strategic military perspectives. And forces will need to be credible, aware, networked, agile, and resilient. Well, I will just point out three of them. The credibility part is match what we say with what we do. Very important, fundamental for the military presence to be welcomed in very complex theaters. Networked doesn't mean network like in information and communication technology, but means networking in the idea of a cooperative, powerful, persistent, and proactive engagement with everyone, organizations, governmental or non-governmental, and other actors. This characteristic at a certain point in the development of this document was called federated, but still it was so much attracted to the ICT field that in the end we decided to call it networked. And agile. The agility perspective is very relevant and very important, also looking at the conclusions that I will try to reach in a moment. The agility means being able to effectively respond to dynamic and complex operational challenges, as well as seize opportunities with appropriate and timely actions. And very important, looking at what COVID-19 is doing, operating with as few operational caveats as possible, and maximizing agility and utility. What forces will need to do are called future abilities, and future abilities are being able to prepare, project, engage, protect, sustain, inform, consult, command, and control. These are very broad ways to describe the spectrum of many different things that a force will be needing to master to stay relevant in future theaters. So the report are publicly available. Just Google them. So apart from SFA and FFAO, there are other two documents that are part of the 4 documents that make the NATO futures work. That are the science and technology trends and the longer term aspects of military capability requirements. These two documents are very important because they are supporting the overall analysis of future scenarios and the future operating environment. The future capability development, the document here in the middle, looks at more than 20 years. And it's the furthest capability document that we have to see at the furthest horizon we have. The objective of these documents are the early identification and engagement of game-changing technologies. Game-changing technologies for us are technology or technological developments that radically alter the conduct of conflict, that force the adaptation of planning process, and change long-term goals, strategies, and plans. Think of the stealth or our ownership of the night. Game changers are usually at the core of preserving what is called the offset, namely a persistent, pervasive, univocal, and unbalanced advantage, which shifts the competition from an unfavorable scenario to one that allows the application of forces to an otherwise immovable problem or surmountable at an acceptable cost. The offset is it's the concept that is at the core of strategic advantage. And it's generally achieved through a long-term technological superiority strategy that is called an offset strategy. In this ties the idea of using science fiction to help framing scenarios that are not really straightforward to us. And this is a document that was done in NATO ACT, delivering to Hollywood screenwriters the strategic foresight analysis and the framework for future alliance operation. There are 10 short stories that are very insightful to have an idea, a different idea of what future theaters can be. Nations are doing their part too. Like France with their document of imagining what's beyond, that is driving the defense innovation, and that is the vision for their defense innovation agency. Or Italy with the dual use and resilience, the document in the middle. The dual use and resilience, it's a concept addendum to programmatic lines of development to the ministry, and was with the former Minister of Defense. And the vision for a strategy 2040 for future trends. The interesting thing here is that there were the strategic military perspectives in the framework for future alliance operations in NATO, this document from Italy identifies 5 national perspectives that are equally interesting for the broader picture. So in this document, they point out that a part of being CANOR, so credible, aware, networked, agile, and resilient, our future armed forces will need to be effective and efficient, and they give a very strict definition of what is effectiveness and efficiency with regards to what are the key performance indicators for that. It has to be economically sustainable because the blanket is always short. They has to be energetically neutral and ethically aligned. It's a very, very far-sighted document. Also, the UK goes through pretty much the same process. So articulated in two phases: understanding the trends that are shaping the geostrategic chessboard and drawing implications for the military and the future operating environment. What I like to say is that in all these efforts, there is an intense research on how we look differently at the future. How do we scope futures and deep futures while identifying the weak signals that might surface in the process? Then there's the United States that have a very structured way of going through the future operating environment. They have a joint operating environment 2040 that is the baseline understanding of the future operating environment to set the conditions for a joint concept-driven threat-informed capability development. And this describes future global realities, how you evolve adversary ways of war, and the implication for the future force. So there's a part one that comes from the Joint Strategic Assessment. The second part comes from Game Changers document, and the third part, that is the implications for the joint force, are informed by the National Defense Strategy. All of this ties into what is called the capstone concept for joint operations. That is the main document that resets joint force development and force design to retain United States advantage under condition of great power competition, disruptive technology, and accelerated pace of change. The Casa Concept for joint operations articulates the effort into three main lines. That is force employment, meaning achieve the objectives, and it goes from 0 to 3 years. Then force development, meaning enable the joint force to do what it does, but better, in 2 to 7 years. And then force design, that is enable the joint force to do what it does differently. This is much along the lines of Engelbart ABC model. So the A level, business as usual; B level, improving how we do that; and C level, improve how we improve. The characteristic of the joint force, of the future joint force in the United States, are strength, agility, endurance, resilience, and flexibility. So still this idea of agility and flexibility, because the overall conditions are changing, is recalled and found in many of the documents of the Defense Foresight. All of these documents set the bar pretty much around 20 years from now. Is it meaningful to go further than that? It is. We did some great work on Space Future 2060 with the Space Force, before the Space Force were actually born. And that was to inform future US strategy and the establishment of the Space Force. And going so far in the future allows you to do impressive things, also looking at like convergent waves of new developments. So, were armed force unprepared? Armed force are never unprepared. They can be more prepared or less prepared, but I can tell you that the margin of unpreparedness for armed forces I have been working with is less than the minute. So trust your forces back at home. What we can say is that they were not given adequate resources, relevance, and responsibilities enough in advance to make a radical difference. And the point I would like to make here is that the Foresight community was spot on this pandemic. And you can find clear and alarming messages, both in FFAO, the Framework for Future Alliance Operations, where pandemic is one of the instability situations, meaning what we really need to have in the future. In GST6, so the UK, in France, as crisis response in situation of disorganization of means and high uncertainties, and in the Italian document, having new healthcare module forward assets able to sustain collective care. So in this, and I am wrapping up quickly, I have to wholeheartedly agree with what was shown by John Sweeney on Thursday, on his Thursday presentation. This pandemic was a massive failure of communication in the foresight community. So quickly, how will this war change our future forces? The blanket is always short. So on one side, we will have budget constraints because of this crisis. And on the other side, our defenses will more and more engage in other lateral activities, not strictly related to its mission of the defense of the homeland. What will be the new paradigms here? One is anti-fragility, that is beyond resilience or robustness. This means thriving from stressors. The classical example is muscles. Muscles grow as a result of repeated stress. And this is a characteristic of complex systems, of complex organizations. So anti-fragility means becoming more complex and weaponize that complexity. A point about anti-fragility is multi-purpose by design. That's something that is found in the NATO FFAO, in the Italian document, and in the United States Casa Concept for joint operations, meaning having assets capable of conducting many types of operations. Having a ship that is a warship, but also can deliver water, pure water, or electricity. That's a multi-purpose by design asset. Centaurs is a way of exploiting digital cleaving power, Florida's digital cleaving power. Being able to become a blended, convergent being, a man-machine unicum, but not like the Terminator. It's not like the Terminator. And it's not like human versus machine. Means blending biological and artificial intelligence into an inextricably linked converged whole that is capable of more than the sum of its parts. And this because data, for example, are generated not only in the physical world and not only in the cyber world. So to exploit the overall information that we have to be present in both with the best of our capacities. And lastly, and I'm done, we will have unexpected innovation. That as a complex, we can show resilience, and not just resilience, but the anti-fragility through the supporting part of emerging and disruptive technologies. I'm going through the questions that I have left, if the organizer will let me. Very quickly.
Yes, but Gabriel, we only have like a couple minutes.
2 minutes, okay? All right.
Because, yeah, it's we need 5 fresh minutes to prepare the next presentation. So everyone can take a note of the email, Gabriel's
yes,
email.
Of course, please connect with me. If you have questions or you want references, I am very glad to connect with you and keep the conversation going. So I have this war against COVID-19 is changing the concept of allied countries. And unfortunately, we have discovered that we need a global strategy and capabilities to fight war against a global enemy. I'm not sure of the question that is here, but what I see is that globally, it is rarely the military that fails in connecting with the other military. What most of the time fails is the political level. So as my experience with NATO most of the time works when the decisions pass from the political side to the military side. The military side, once the political level has agreed to all the details, the military side is like straightforward, like hot knife in a butter. And I won't be able to answer another one. I see it's 5 minutes to go. Thanks for having invited me. It was a great pleasure being here, and hope to connect with most of the listeners here.